Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As I said in the beginning of trial, and you now know, this case is called the People versus Maya Hernandez. But we are here because of two babies. We are here because of 1-year-old Amilio and 2-year-old Mateo. We are here because on June 29th, 2025, the defendant, the biological mother of Amilio and Mateo, chose herself. She chose herself at the expense of her children. She chose herself at the expense of Amilio's life. We are here because on June 29th, 2025, the defendant chose her looks. She chose to make an appointment in Bakersfield, a cosmetic procedure. In her words, a procedure to make her feel more beautiful. That choice, ladies and gentlemen, the choice for her to feel more beautiful, to focus on herself, to focus on her looks, killed Amilio. On that day, she chose the appointment in Bakersfield. She chose to drive from Visalia to Bakersfield with her 2 children. She chose not to get a babysitter, knowing she had options. She chose to bring them to Bakersfield, knowing that she would be permitted to bring the kids into the building and they could wait in the waiting room. But what choice did she make, ladies and gentlemen, when she got to Bakersfield? She chose to leave them in the car. She didn't choose to leave them in the car while she ran inside to get milk. She didn't choose to leave them in the car while she ran to the mailbox. She chose to leave them in the car for 2.5 hours. 2.5 hours where she did not check on them one single time. And ladies and gentlemen, what was happening to Amilio while the defendant was sitting inside the building, while she was chatting with other adults, while she was socializing, while she was in a cool atmosphere? What was happening to Amilio when his mother, the one person who was supposed to protect him, the one person who was supposed to put him above all else, what was happening to Amilio as she sat in the building and ignored her responsibilities? He was burning from the inside out. His body was rising to temperatures that are not compatible with life. You heard that quotation from Dr. Thomas Riley. His body temperatures were not compatible with life. While his mother sat inside, socializing, laughing, chatting, sharing stories about cosmetic procedures, talking about her plans, talking about how hot it was outside. Amilio was perishing in the car while Mateo sat there and watched. Ladies and gentlemen, as adults, we are all entitled to make choices. We get to choose what we do on a daily basis. That's part of being an adult. But the other side to that coin is, as an adult, when you make a choice and that's a bad choice, you have to be held accountable. The defendant in this case on June 29th, 2025, made many, many, many bad choices. All of those choices benefited her at the peril of her children. It is now time for her to be held accountable for those choices. It is time for her to be accountable for leaving her 2 babies in the car, knowing it was dangerous and knowing it was irresponsible. And ladies and gentlemen, you as the jury now get to look at the defendant and tell her that her choices were wrong. That putting her vanity, her looks, her desire to feel beautiful above her children was wrong. Not only was it wrong, but it was criminal. Not only was it wrong and criminal, but she did it knowing it was dangerous, knowing it was wrong, knowing it could harm. And ladies and gentlemen, you are going to convey that message to the defendant. You are going to tell her it's time for her to be held accountable. You're going to tell her what she did was wrong by finding her guilty of the murder of Amilio and the child abuse likely to cause great bodily injury of Mateo. That is the opportunity you are going to get to have at the end of this case. After I speak with you, after Mr. Wakeman speaks with you. But in order for you to make those findings, you need to know the law. You need to know the law and how that law connects with the evidence. So I want to take some time this morning and I want to go through the evidence you have in this case. I'm going to connect that to the law in this case. And at the end of my argument, I will explain to you why the evidence, when mixed with the law, when compared to the law, is going to be sufficient for you to find the defendant guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And I want to apologize ahead of time. You might have to hear me talking for quite a while this morning. There's going to be a lot I have to say. You might find what I'm saying to be boring at times. You might find what I'm saying or what I'm publishing to you to be redundant at times. And there will be some slides you will see multiple times. But ladies and gentlemen, as you now know, this is an important case. The evidence and the law is important. It is important that when you go into that jury deliberation room, you are fully equipped to make the appropriate decision. And I want to take some time this morning to make sure that you have the tools necessary to make the just verdict in this case. So first you have the information. Count 1, second-degree murder of Amilio. The lesser included, it shows as count 2. It is a lesser included offense. She cannot be found guilty of both. Involuntary manslaughter of Amilio. Count 3, child abuse of Amilio resulting in his death. And count 4, child abuse of Mateo. Second-degree murder of Amilio, count 1. And I'm sure, ladies and gentlemen, you can imagine the bulk of my discussion with you this morning, the bulk of my argument is going to be spent on this very charge. I'm sure you have noticed throughout the evidence that this charge is why we are here today. We are here because Amilio died at the hands of his mother. We are here because she caused his death. She did it with conscious disregard for human life, and she knew the dangers to human life when she acted. The elements. And again, as I described in opening statements, there are 2 different ways in this case, not in every case, but in this case, there are 2 different ways to get to second-degree murder. First, second-degree murder, implied malice theory. Commission of an act. The second way, which I will discuss in a moment, is second-degree murder, failure to act. First way, commission of an act. Second way, failure to act as a mother. Defendant committed an act that caused the death of Amilio. When the defendant acted, she had a state of mind called malice aforethought. Malice aforethought is defined for you in the instructions. In your instruction for this charge, instruction 520, there's going to be one single sentence that tells you what express malice is. That sentence can be ignored. This is not a case of express malice. I am not, and I will not argue to you this morning that the defendant had an intent to kill Amilio. We are here for implied malice. And implied malice means she intentionally committed the act. She intentionally left Amilio in the car. That's the act that satisfies the first element of implied malice. The natural and probable consequences of the act were dangerous to human life in that the act involved a high degree of probability that it would result in death. She left Amilio and Mateo in the car for 2.5 hours in the middle of a Bakersfield summer in extreme heats. At the time she acted, she knew the act was dangerous to human life. And ladies and gentlemen, I submit to you that I anticipate most of what this case and today's arguments are going to rely on falls right here. At the time she acted, she knew the act was dangerous to human life. You know, based upon her interviews with Detective McNabb, based upon her actions, based upon her failures to tell anybody inside of the spa that she had her children with her, that she knew her acts were dangerous, that she knew they were dangerous to human life. She got in here and she testified and she told you a different story. I will spend some time going over which of those statements is going to get you where you need to go. And she deliberately acted with conscious disregard for human life. She knew what she was doing, she knew it was dangerous, and she did it anyway. She knew it was dangerous to leave the babies in the car, but she did it anyway. She did it anyway because that day, June 29th, 2025, was about Maya. It was about Maya's wants, Maya's needs. That day was never about Amilio. It was never about Mateo. And it was never about protecting the boys. Second-degree murder, failure to protect. This one, first element, the defendant had a legal duty to protect Amilio, and the defendant failed to perform that duty, and that failure caused the death of Amilio. You will see in the instruction for this crime that a mother has a legal duty to protect. You don't have to guess on that. You don't have to speculate. That is the law. You know that the defendant in this case is the biological mother of both Amilio and Mateo. You know that it was her duty to protect as the mother, and she failed to do so. She gave you this element when she testified. She says she knows she failed to protect them. She failed to protect them because she should have brought them in with her. She should have left them with a babysitter. She should have done absolutely anything, ladies and gentlemen, other than leaving them in a car to burn and perish. When the defendant failed to act, she had a state of mind called malice aforethought. Implied malice, again, ladies and gentlemen, the same requirements for both ways to get to second-degree murder. The only thing that changes is the act versus the failure to act and the failure to perform her duty as a mother. We often hear the term malice, and in ordinary language, that sounds like a bad word. Like that sounds like we have to have hatred, ill will. No, ladies and gentlemen, not in this courtroom, not in the law. The law will specifically tell you when you're looking at Calcrim 520, malice aforethought does not require hatred or ill will towards the victim. The defendant did not have to be mad at Amilio. The defendant did not have to hate Amilio. It's okay that you saw those photographs of the defendant showing affection and loving Amilio. None of that negates the elements of second-degree murder. Nothing that you saw in those photographs negates implied malice. It's okay that she wasn't upset with Amilio. It's okay that she didn't hate him. It's okay that she did not intentionally kill him. Because none of that is required for second-degree murder, ladies and gentlemen. Now that you know the charges and the law that apply to those charges, how does that intertwine with your duties, with your job as the jury, ladies and gentlemen? It is now your job to decide what happened that day. It is your job to decide what was the defendant thinking that day. What did she know before she got out of the car? It's your job to decide that. And you decide that by taking all of the evidence you have heard, the witness statements, the testimony, the photos, the defendant's recorded interview, text messages to the nurse. You get to take all of that and you decide what happened that day. You decide what was she thinking that day. You apply that to the law. And once you do that, you come to a conclusion. And that is your job, ladies and gentlemen, as the jury. We told you during voir dire that you can't come in with special knowledge. You can't come in with your own medical opinion as to what happened. You can't come in with any preconceived notions about what happened. You can't come in with, oh, the media said this, I'm going to believe A, B, or C. But the one thing we never asked you to leave outside was your common sense. And that's because your common sense is of utmost importance in your deliberations and your deciding what happened in this case. Do not leave your common sense in this courtroom when you go into the jury deliberation room. Take it with you and use it. How did we get here today, ladies and gentlemen? As I've previously described, the defendant made an appointment to drive from Visalia to Bakersfield to receive a cosmetic procedure. Now, when she initially testified on direct, she attempted to make it sound like this was a last-minute sort of thing, that she had to come and there wasn't really much time for planning. But you learned on cross-examination that that was not the case, that she knew about this appointment for at least days ahead of time, and that she had been attempting to schedule this appointment since early May. But more importantly, ladies and gentlemen, you know that this was not a mandatory procedure. This was not a procedure that she needed for her health or well-being. This was an elective cosmetic procedure for the sole purpose of enhancing her looks and helping to make her feel beautiful. So any statements that I didn't have enough time to decide what I was going to do with him or find a babysitter, those go out the window. Because this was all based around the choices she made. This was not an emergent situation. It was not a last-minute situation. The defendant made the choice to drive to Bakersfield with the two boys, Amilio and Mateo. She knew before she left home that she could bring the boys inside the spa with her. They would simply have to wait in the waiting room. She knew that she had a stroller in her car that both of the boys could sit in, be strapped in, just like in their car seats, and sit in the spa. She chose none of that, ladies and gentlemen. She arrived in Bakersfield. She chose to go inside at approximately 2:04 p.m., and at that time, she chose to leave her children in the car. She sat inside that business in the same chair from 2:05 to 4:09 p.m. Did not move from the chair, ladies and gentlemen. You watched that. She didn't get up to check on her appointment time. She didn't get up to ask how much longer. She didn't get up to tell anybody she was in a hurry. She didn't get up to check on her kids. At 4:09, she goes back for her procedure, and at 4:33, she leaves the building. Even at this time, ladies and gentlemen, 4:33 p.m., she does not leave to go check on her kids. And you heard that through her interviews with detectives. She left to go get her phone to pay. Even when she left at 4:33, her children were not the priority. She did not leave to go get her children. She left to go get her money. Again, with Maya as the priority, not her children. After a 911 call is made at 4:40 p.m. on that day, officers are dispatched around 4:43 p.m. and arrive approximately 4:45 p.m. at the business that day. By the time officers arrive, this was Officer Velez Aguilar and Officer Fahel. Hall ambulance personnel are already on scene providing treatment to Amilio. You saw the body-worn camera, ladies and gentlemen. You saw Amilio's lifeless body on the gurney. Amilio was ultimately transported to Adventist Hospital, where he was treated by Nurse Gabrielle Long and Dr. Thomas Riley. You heard from both of those witnesses. You heard that at the scene, officers also observed Mateo. Now, by the time officers saw Mateo, he was soaking wet, he was red. A lot of that water, that soaking wet, did in fact come from efforts of Harmony and Shelby to cool him down, putting water on him, pouring water on him. But you also heard from Shelby and Harmony that before they started putting water on Mateo, he looked like he was about to have a stroke. He was hot to the touch, and he was sweaty. You heard Ian Blue describe Mateo. He said, it's a term we use in Spanish. It means kind of like wet chicken, the way he looked with his hair wet and stuck to his face when he went into the business. Mateo was also transported to Adventist Health Hospital. Amilio arrived at the hospital at about 5:00 p.m. He was ultimately pronounced deceased at 4:48 or 5:48 p.m. I apologize. You heard from Dr. Riley. They were as aggressive as possible in their attempts to save Amilio. They were as aggressive as possible in resuscitating him. They were as aggressive as possible in attempting to cool his body. They did cool his temperature from about 107 to 101, but that was not sufficient because it was too late. And you heard from Dr. Riley that early intervention could have saved Amilio. The defendant going out to her car to check on Amilio could have and would have saved Amilio. You heard Dr. Riley talk about how heartbreaking it was to see a 12-month-old in the condition Amilio was in. That it was gut-wrenching that he was unable to save Amilio on that day. He even said at one point, physicians are humans too. They don't put on a cloak and not have feelings. And he explained those feelings to you of seeing a 12-month-old boy come in completely lifeless. We'll talk more about his testimony in a few minutes. Mateo was transported to the hospital. While in the hospital, his temperature was approximately 99 degrees. He was fine and he was ultimately released. You heard Nurse Elizabeth Bond explain to you the difference, why Mateo was okay, but Amilio wasn't. And it was because of their age. Amilio was not yet able to regulate his inside temperature because of his age. Mateo had more developed sweat glands, which explains the sweat on the outside of his body when he was located. Video surveillance. The detectives had information. The defendant told them, I left him in the car for 2 hours. She was very forthcoming about that from the start, ladies and gentlemen. The detectives could have rested on that and been like, okay, she told us. They wanted to see what happened that day. They wanted to make sure this was a complete and thorough investigation, so they got the video surveillance from the business. In that video surveillance, you can see the defendant walking up to the business at about 2:04 p.m., ultimately takes the seat by the, not the west door, but the door across, where she sits for the rest of the time until 4:09 p.m. At 4:09 p.m., you see the defendant get up and walk in the area that we have been told is the area of the rooms for service, room B6. You also saw that and can see that on the body-worn camera footage of Detective Barthelms conducting the measurements into the building. The defendant ultimately leaves the building for the first time at 4:33 p.m. You heard about the search of the defendant's vehicle. The infotainment screen was broken. They were not able to get any immediate information from the infotainment system about what specifically was happening in that car. There was a bottle found behind the passenger seat, right by where Amilio's seat was. And ladies and gentlemen, this might seem very minor, but it's not. You heard that the bottle found by Amilio's seat was 2/3 full. You also know that Amilio was strapped into his car seat. He could not get out. If he dropped that bottle while he was still okay, he had no liquids to drink. If he dropped that bottle after he had began to perish, he began to perish pretty quickly before he could even get halfway through his bottle. Neither of those scenarios is beneficial to Amilio. Both of those scenarios tell you that had the defendant gone out to check on them, she could have fixed the situation. You also heard that the defendant had a stroller in the trunk of her car. This also might have seemed like a fairly insignificant find when you heard the evidence. But you now know that it was not insignificant, ladies and gentlemen. This piece of evidence is not insignificant. This piece of evidence tells you that the defendant had the means to bring the kids inside with her. She had the means to literally put them the same way they were in the car. Sit each of them in their seat, strap them with the harnesses that you saw in Defense Exhibit 10, hand them the phone, and let them watch TV. Same exact condition they were left in the car. But in the stroller, they would have been inside, out of the elements, not subject to the heat, and we wouldn't be here today. But Amilio would. But the defendant chose not to use control them while inside the business, and that is not what she wanted to do on that day. You heard from witness Shelby Murch that she was a patron that day at the med spa. She was also waiting for her procedure. She was there approximately 30 minutes before the defendant arrived. She told you and she described for you the atmosphere in the waiting room. And you ultimately got to see the atmosphere, ladies and gentlemen, but Ms. Murch described it for you before you saw the video surveillance. And what you saw in that video surveillance perfectly matched what Ms. Murch told you. It was a friendly, welcoming, lively atmosphere. People were chatting, they were talking, there was another child. While the defendant was in the waiting room, she was bubbly and engaging in conversations with the other patrons. Bubbly and engaging in conversations with the other patrons, she told them that she had 2 little babies. She told them what her plans were for the 4th of July in a few days. What she didn't tell anybody inside of the waiting room was that her 2 little babies were actually there. What she didn't tell anybody in the waiting room was that her 2 little babies were strapped in her car. She testified, "Oh, I didn't tell them because they're strangers and I don't want to tell them about my life." But ladies and gentlemen, this is where you get to use your common sense. You know better. You know that's not why she withheld that information. She was talking to these people about getting things injected into her butt. She was talking to them about her plans. She was talking to them about the fact that she had children. Oh, but the fact that she had them with her was simply too personal? No, ladies and gentlemen. She knew that it was wrong and that it was criminal, and that if they knew, she would have a problem. That's why she didn't tell anybody her kids were with her in the car. After the defendant's procedure, the defendant left the building and went outside. Shortly after, a few minutes later, the defendant came in carrying Amilio. Amilio, who was completely limp, turning colors, his limbs just hanging. She came in and brought Amilio into the nurse's room. Shortly after that, Miss Murch saw Isabel Carrion come in with Mateo. And Shelby described to you how Mateo looked. He was gasping for air, had bubbles coming from his mouth, had peed through his diaper, sweat through his onesie, was holding an empty bottle. You also heard that he looked like he was going to have a stroke, and that when she touched him and held him, he was hot to the touch. And ladies and gentlemen, these characteristics, these observations are of the child that survived. These observations, gasping for air, bubbly mouth, hot to the touch, those are of the child that is okay. Imagine what Amilio was going through. She and Harmony took Mateo into the bathroom where they put water on him, tried to cool him down. They continued their attempts to cool him down when they brought him back out. You actually saw those attempts in the video surveillance where Shelby's holding Mateo and Harmony's patting under his clothes with the wet cloth, trying to cool him down. Then they go and rinse out his dirty milk, rotten milk probably at that time, bottle, and fill it with water for him. And Shelby also told you something that was very telling, ladies and gentlemen. While the defendant was in the waiting room, she was approached and asked by another mother, the mother and grandmother combo sitting on the black couch, to watch their child while she went to the bathroom. And the defendant did. This was over an hour before, and you can see it in the video surveillance, over an hour before the defendant went into her procedure. At that time, she knew people in there were staying. They were waiting for their appointments. They were willing to help each other out. She knew she could have asked one of them, hey, if I bring my kids in here, can you watch them for the few minutes I'm in my procedure? She knew there were options. She chose not to take those options because that would have interfered with her break. At some point, another husband, wife, and another child came into the waiting room. You saw that, ladies and gentlemen. It was the man and the young boy that sat just around the corner from the defendant's chair. You also heard from Ian Blue. He went to the location with Shelby that day. They were friends. You heard from both Ian and Shelby that it was so hot outside. Before they went in, they stopped at the gas station to get ice cream. It was a noticeably hot day. You heard from Ian that throughout the time the defendant was in the waiting room, there were probably about 10 people in total that came and went and were waiting. You also saw that when you watched the video surveillance. You heard from him that the waiting room atmosphere was friendly, engaging, and all the women were talking to each other. This was not an environment, ladies and gentlemen, that is meant to be serene, calm, quiet. That was not this waiting room. This was the waiting room that would have been conducive to kids. This is a waiting room that was conducive to kids. This was a waiting room that had kids in it and that the defendant knew had kids in it. You also heard from Ian, and this was the very important part of his testimony, that at approximately 3 p.m. on that day, he went outside to take his dog to go to the bathroom, Bowser. When he was outside, he was standing by the tree, right by the fence, about 2 to 3 feet from the defendant's car. And he was very clear and unequivocal when he told you, ladies and gentlemen, that that car was not running. There were no signs that that car was running, that any of the systems were running, that there was any air conditioning going on at about 3 p.m. He also told you he had no idea there was anybody inside of the vehicle. There was absolutely nothing to indicate there was anybody inside of the vehicle, and he was unable to see inside due to the dark tint. While Ian was outside, he noticed it was so hot that he had to bring Bowser back inside to get water. Ian recognized that it was too hot outside for his dog to remain outside during the same time of day that the defendant had her kids essentially locked in an inferno with rising heats. Ian thought it was too hot for his dog, but the defendant did not think it was too hot for her babies. Ian was back inside of the business when the defendant left, and shortly after, the defendant came back in with Amilio, followed by Mateo with Miss Carry-On after that. And this is where Ian described Mateo as looking like a wet chicken, which is a term that's commonly used in the the Spanish language, according to Mr. Blue. Mr. Blue explained to you that Mateo looked like he was going to have a heat stroke and was gasping for air. These statements, ladies and gentlemen, they might sound redundant. Why did we have to hear the same thing from Shelby that we heard from Ian? And that's because, ladies and gentlemen, these statements show you that they're true. 2 different people made the same observations and came in and told you the same thing. That is evidence. That's corroboration that what they saw actually happened. Their testimony is supported by other testimony, other evidence. And while Ian was on the stand, he talked about some of the conversation that was happening inside of the business. He told you, ladies and gentlemen, that when the man and his son came in, there was a statement made that they had to come in because it was simply too hot to wait outside. This statement was made in the same vicinity, in earshot of the defendant. You know this because Mr. Blue specifically told you that he interpreted for the man, and he repeated the statement loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. Not only was this statement made, ladies and gentlemen, there was a conversation that followed. A conversation whereby the people in the waiting room started almost joking about the fact, yeah, imagine how hot it is outside with how warm it is in here, and we have some air conditioning. Those conversations, ladies and gentlemen, took place with the defendant while her kids were trapped in the heat. Even those conversations did not make the defendant think, oh, I should probably go check on them. It is pretty hot. She heard the statements, and much like everything else she did that day, she ignored them as they related to her children. She ignored her children. She did not check on them, even though other people came in and were talking about how hot it was outside. Then you heard from Ms. Isabel Carrion, Harmony's assistant. She told you that the defendant came in that day for a treatment to her buttocks area. You later learned it's referred to as a liquid BBL, a liquid Brazilian butt lift. Injections into somebody's butt to enhance the appearance. She's the assistant. After the defendant's procedure, she did not pay right away. She said she had to go to her car to get her phone. Some time had passed. Ms. Carrion was concerned that the defendant was going to leave without paying, so she went outside. Her car, her BMW, the white one in the photograph, was parked directly next to the defendant's. When she got to the car, she saw the defendant holding Amilio and moving him upside down. Not on the phone with 911, not giving CPR, not trying to get help, moving Amilio up and down in the car. This action, ladies and gentlemen, came after, from what you heard from Detective McNabb, that the defendant walked towards the business and then back out. Again, that might seem like a small piece of evidence, but think to yourself, she obviously started walking towards the business because she thought perhaps she could get help. And then realized, but then they're all going to know that I have my kids with me. They're all going to know that I left my kids in the heat in the car. That's not going to look bad, or not going to look good, I apologize. So she turns around and walks back to her car. About 2 minutes later is when Ms. Carrion comes out, sees her in her car, tells her, you need to go get help. Your baby is not okay. At that point, she goes inside, subsequently comes back out and calls 911 at 4:40 p.m. 6 minutes passed in that time period, ladies and gentlemen. Think about 6 minutes and how long 6 minutes truly feels. And you're going to see how long Amilio sat there again without getting the help he needed while his mother, his protector, was trying to figure out how to cover up her actions. You heard from Ms. Carrion that the defendant was not showing any urgency, was not screaming, was not asking for help. Ms. Carrion only knew Mateo was in the back seat because she saw him due to the rolled down passenger side window. The window that was only rolled down after the defendant went back outside. The defendant did not tell her, help my other baby. She just took off with Amilio inside. Isabel saw Mateo in the back seat. She described Mateo as too hot. His skin was red, and flushed all over. He was weak and drenched with sweat. She also described the inside of the car. She initially said that it was hot, very hot. And then she agreed that she had actually told Ian, and I apologize for my language, ladies and gentlemen, but she had told Ian that when she reached her hand in the car to get Mateo, the inside of the car was hot as hell. Compare that statement, ladies and gentlemen, to the defendant's description of inside the car during her interviews with detectives. Compare that, the statement of Miss Carry-On, who has no reason to embellish, no reason to exaggerate, to the defendant who said, it was pretty comfortable. When you know, ladies and gentlemen, that there's no way, shape, or form that vehicle could have been comfortable at that time. Miss Carry-On told you that when she got into the car to get Mateo, the car was not running. The air conditioner was not on. Those also contradict the defendant's statements. And again, ladies and gentlemen, and I will encourage you, when you are considering what statements are credible, what statements to give the most weight to, take out Calcrim 226. Put that on your desk while you're thinking of the witnesses. And ask yourself, well, did Shelby, Ian, Harmony, who we'll get to in a second, Isabel, did they have any reason to lie? Did they have any reason to exaggerate? Did they have any bias or interest in this case? Those are things that are outlined for you in 226, things that you get to consider. And the answer to all those questions is going to be no. These are people who did not know the defendant until that day. They didn't know her before, they don't know her after. They were there for some cosmetic treatment and really ended up in a horrible situation. A horrible situation that is probably going to impact their entire lives. So when you are looking at what these people said and you're comparing it to what the defendant said, then ask yourself, well, did the defendant have reason to lie? Absolutely. Did the defendant have reason to downplay? Absolutely. Did the defendant have a personal interest in how the case is decided? Absolutely. Does the defendant have a bias in this case? Absolutely. You take those two statements, you take the inconsistencies, and when you use those with Calcrim 226, you are going to find that you have to believe and give credence and credibility to Harmony, Isabel, Shelby, and Ian long before the defendant. You heard from the nurse, Ms. Pacheco. She explained to you that she is an aesthetic injector. She provides cosmetic procedures to help enhance appearances. These procedures are not medically necessary. Certainly the procedure that the defendant was receiving that day, the liquid Brazilian butt lift, was not medically necessary. These are things to make people feel beautiful. They are elective, chosen procedures. She told you that the defendant's procedure took about 15 to 20 minutes. That's consistent with what you saw in the video surveillance. She told you that during the morning hours of June 29th, 2025, she told the defendant that she could bring her kids in. You saw those text messages, ladies and gentlemen. You have them with you in the back if you want to look at them again. That conversation, you know, from both the defendant and from Ms. Pacheco happened before the defendant left Visalia that day. Ms. Pacheco told you that the defendant told her she had to go get her phone from her car because she left it in there because it was dead. The defendant told you that was a lie. That was not what she told Ms. Pacheco. So again, ask yourself, what reason did Harmony have to make that up? Absolutely none. And also look back at her testimony and consider how that testimony came out. She didn't come in here and say, yeah, she said it was dead and that's why she went out and now I know she's lying. She actually couldn't remember right away if that is what the defendant said. She refreshed her memory with the transcript of the statement she gave on the date of the interview. She didn't come in here with any malice. She didn't have an agenda. She was just testifying to you what she saw and what she observed on that day. She saw the defendant then come back in with Amilio. Amilio was limp, purple, and foaming at the mouth. Again, common descriptions throughout, ladies and gentlemen. When she saw Amilio, she told the defendant to call an ambulance because it was clear that he was not okay. And shortly after that, she saw Isabel come inside with Mateo. She said Mateo looked very hot, was hot to the touch, and his heart was beating really fast. This is an important statement, ladies and gentlemen, especially in light of what you heard yesterday from Dr. Thomas Riley. Harmony Pacheco, a registered nurse, told you that she felt Mateo's heart rate and it was beating really fast. Yesterday, Dr. Thomas Riley testified. He testified in the context of Amilio. He was a doctor for Amilio. But he also told you that hyperthermia, one of the things that happens when somebody's body is going through that, is their heart begins to beat really fast, essentially until it gives out. So you know that this statement is consistent with what could have been happening. And that Mateo might not have been as bad as Amilio, but he sure was on his way had he not been caught when he was. Based on Mateo's appearance, she took him to the bathroom where she put water on him. She then started putting wet cloths on his body to try to cool him down because he looked like he was going to have a stroke. His bottle, was empty and appeared that it had old milk in it, so she had Isabel rinse it out and put water in it. Again, ladies and gentlemen, you know it was old milk because the defendant testified in court and told detectives that she had left each child with 1 bottle of milk. 1 bottle of milk for 2.5 hours, including the drive from Visalia to Bakersfield. Then text messages, you'll have those in the back with you. They just confirm the conversation. Then you heard from Nurse Gabrielle Long. She was the treating nurse to Amilio. She told you that Amilio's temperature was 107 degrees when he came in on June 29th, 2025. And ladies and gentlemen, I want you to consider something very important when you think about the testimony of Gabrielle Long, Elizabeth Bond, and Dr. Thomas Riley. These are medical professionals who, by their own testimony, see emergencies all day, every day. Not a single one of them had to come in here and reference any documents as to this incident. Not a single one of them had issues remembering Amilio or Mateo from that day. Gabrielle Long tell you that she had never seen a temperature that high in her career. She also told you that Amilio's temperature was likely higher when he was in the car before he had been exposed to the airflow outside, exposed to the air conditioner in the ambulance, and transported into the hospital. Nurse Elizabeth Bond, she provided treatment to Mateo. She came in here and told you that Mateo was fine. He was responsive, he was okay. The one thing she noticed that was interesting to her was that Mateo was very clingy to the hospital staff. And she said, this is weird because most children don't want to be around us. Most children go away from us. He was clingy. He wanted to be held. He wanted to be comforted. And why is that, ladies and gentlemen? Because that day, just before he met Elizabeth Bond, he had been abandoned. He had been abandoned by his protector, by the person that's supposed to protect him. He sought out comfort in strangers because he didn't get that from his mother. She explained to you that the difference between Mateo's temperature and Amilio's, again, can be explained by their age, the body's ability to release sweat, regulate its